Indomitable Heart by Renette. Chapter 8. The Daybreaker, with its hundreds of Mando'a warriors, arrived right on schedule. The massive cruiser dwarfed the Naboo vessel, and with its bristling turbo-laser emplacements, it was much different in style than the Queen's sleek chromium-plated yacht. Almost as soon as the proximity alarm sounded in the Queen's yacht, the comm began to ring. Amidala nodded to her handmaiden, and the hollow resolved into an image of Jango.
"Your Majesty," Jango greeted, "my scouts are pre-flight. They should arrive in the Naboo system in a few hours. As soon as they do, I'll contact you again so we can hear their news together."
Amidala nodded. They exchanged a few more words and then signed off. Obi-Wan wanted badly to contact Jango on his personal comm, but refrained. Now wasn't the time. A few hours later, the two ships were in contact again, with the hot Mando'a scouts on comms to share the reconnaissance.
"I'm behind one of the moons, but visuals are good," one of the scouts reported. "I've only got one vessel in my sensors and can confirm by sight. The blockade is no longer in effect. There's only the droid control ship in orbit."
"No signals from the planet except some fuzz on the Trade Federation's frequencies," another scout reported. "Whatever encryption they're using is keeping their signal real quiet."
"Can you also confirm that the only vessel is the droid control ship?"
Jango asked.
"Confirmed," the second scout said firmly. "Only the droid control ship, and it looks like it's keeping geosynchronosis orbit over Theed."
"Fighter patrols?"
Jango asked.
"Not seeing any," one of the scouts responded. "All right, I want you to stay out of sight. Keep your sensors wide. Your relief will be there in a few hours. We'll keep an eye on the planet until we get the Queen back on the throne,"
Jango directed.
"Copy,"
the scouts confirmed, and then Jango toggled the scouts' comms so they were no longer broadcasting to both the Mando and Naboo ships. "Why take down the blockade?" one of the handmaidens asked. Padme, Obi-Wan thought. She was the most outspoken of the lot.
"Waste of ships with Her Majesty already off-planet," Jango guessed. "They're probably all out looking for you."
It was speculation, of course, but it was as logical a guess as any. He shrugged.
"I don't know, my lady, but it makes our job slightly easier and less dangerous. A ship that size will still have plenty of room for fighter wings and a point defense system, but we'll have one big target to aim for rather than trying to break the blockade."
A Mando proverb learned from Silas rose in Obi-Wan's memory.
Haatyc aru'ike, jate'shya ori'sol, aru'ike nuhaatyc.
Better one enemy that you can see than many small ones that you can't. It wasn't a perfect fit for the situation. They would have the one big enemy and many small ones, but if they could take out the droid control ship, they would have solved a very large problem, and solving that large problem might just eliminate the bulk of the smaller ones. Every few hours, they listened as the scouts reported in at the changing of their Overwatch ships above Naboo. No droid fighters patrolling, no ships aside from the droid control ship, no broadcasts or other signals from the planet save the heavily encrypted communications of the Trade Federation. Once Jango was satisfied that they had as much information as they could get without breaking the Trade Federation's encryptions, he laid out the timeline for what was to come. The Naboo Royal Yacht and Jaster's Legacy would leave at the same time as the Daybreaker, the first two flying openly to Theed. Jaster's Legacy would mask their transponder and run electronic countermeasures, making the Mando ship all but invisible to sensors, although that would only fool the Trade Federation until they were in visual range. The Daybreaker would drop out of hyperspace in the shadow of one of the moons and launch fighters a few minutes after the Naboo and Jaster's Legacy arrived in the Naboo system. The cruiser and its fighter escort would take on the droid control ship, while the Naboo and Mando landing party made for the palace in Theed, where they were more than likely to find the Trade Federation leadership. The plan was based on a lot of supposition, but without more information, there wasn't much more they could do. Orders given, they synchronized their chronometers. At the appropriate marks, the ships were underway. Obi-Wan meditated through part of the journey. A niggling feeling of unease built as they flew towards Naboo, but it wasn't the plane itself that bothered him. Their course of action felt right. The Naboo were suffering, and liberating them was the best way to alleviate that suffering. Something else was going on, something that was connected to this, but not clearly. It was elusive, perhaps elsewhere. He was missing something important. Obi-Wan sighed when he came out of his meditation. Such big warnings were helpful in that they made Obi-Wan hyper-aware of both his surroundings and the Force. They were also distinctly annoying, since he couldn't identify what they were about or what would be the best way forward. The source of his unease would become clear eventually, Obi-Wan knew, probably at an inopportune time. Until it did, he would be mindful and do his duty, protect the Queen, and hopefully resolve the situation on Naboo. The ships arrived in the Naboo system as scheduled. Arriving first, the Naboo yacht sailed through space toward Theed, Jaster's legacy, on their wing. The sensor masking held, and with the Trade Federation relying on their instrumentation, which showed only the Royal Naboo ship, not the Mando gunship at its side, no droid fighters appeared to challenge the Mando vessel. Just as the two ships neared the estimated visual range of the droid control ship, Obi-Wan watched on the view screen with the Queen and her handmaidens as the Daybreaker appeared out from the shadow of the moon, and the empty space around the droid control ship filled with vulture droids. As quickly as they flew out to fight, the droid ships exploded into fiery balls of shrapnel, courtesy of the Mando fighters that engaged them. The Daybreaker began pounding at the droid control ship's shields. With battle enjoined in space, the Naboo yacht and its Mando escort settled outside Theed. So far, it seemed the Mando landing party had been unnoticed. When the Queen and her handmaidens disembarked, they were in nearly matching combat suits, only the heavy hairpiece and more elaborate makeup of the Queen distinguishing her from her attendants. Obi-Wan put himself at her shoulder, opening his senses. Jango was leading the landing party of Hot Mando'a, as Obi-Wan had expected. Jango felt as he always did before a fight, cool and collected, concentrating on the tasks at hand. There was still something else, though, that elusive feeling of unease. Was what he was feeling in the Force, Obi-Wan wondered, the loss of Mando life in the skies overhead? He didn't think so, and when he concentrated, the Force seemed to indicate his anxieties originated elsewhere. Slowly, Obi-Wan realized that he knew this bad feeling. It wasn't just a feeling either. It was a presence, a user of the dark side of the Force. He activated his comms.
Jango?
Obi-Wan murmured.
Var to go?
Jango asked, noticing the wariness in Obi-Wan's tone.
Darjetii!
Obi-Wan said grimly.
Jango swore. I'll continue protecting the Queen. It may just be a different enemy than we anticipated.
Copy, Jango said grimly. Oh yeah, he called on the group channel, and then he was airborne, jetpack roaring. A few other Mando'a took off as well, some scouting further ahead, and the others, like Jango, flying overhead. Obi-Wan stayed with the Queen, as promised. They didn't see any droids until they reached the outskirts of the city, and between the Hot Mando'a and the handmaidens, the droids fell quickly. They made rapid progress until they reached the palace district. Tanks set in the broad square before the palace, surrounded by regular B-1 battle droids and hardier droidekas. Two Mando'a went airborne, landing on the tanks. A pair of small bangs, and they threw open the blasted open-top hatches. A cacophony of droid complaints were followed shortly by the louder blasts of detonators being dropped into the heavy machinery, destroying everything inside as the Mando'a activated their jetpacks and flew to safety. The B-1s and droidekas on the ground immediately began to fire, the B-1s spraying their blaster bolts skyward, while the droidekas took slower and more deliberate aim. The Mando'a on the ground had split their group while the droids were distracted, and soon had an effective crossfire going. Only the droidekas survived the first few moments of concentrated fire, their shields snapping up to protect them.
Ears off,
Jango called, and pitched forward a few sonic detonators. The landing party covered their ears or muted their auditory sensors momentarily, and the droidekas collapsed as the shriek of the detonators vibrated their screws loose. The landing party darted across the cleared square and pushed into the palace itself. Inside, the resistance was just as thick. Blaster char soon streaked darkly across the marble and plaster of the palace walls. The Force swelled in warning, and Obi-Wan turned. A being a little shorter than himself stepped into the broad corridor. Obi-Wan assessed them. Zabrak, he thought, although only the crown of horns really reminded him of the Zabraks he had previously met. This being boasted brilliantly red skin with deep black markings, their bodies swathed in figure-disguising black robing. They raised their hilt in challenge, and two red blades seared into sight. Saber staff, Obi-Wan noted, even as he activated his blue-bladed saber. He left the dark saber holstered for the moment, a potential surprise if things went against him.
I'll handle this,
Obi-Wan said, stepping forward to face the Darksider. Obi-Wan had never before felt a Force user so strong in the dark side, but this was not the first Darksider he had faced.
"Oh yeah,"
Jango commanded, and Obi-Wan just grunted, tuning in all his senses to the other Force user. Mentally, Obi-Wan calmed and centered himself. He could hear the others continuing toward the few other life signs in the palace, showing on the Mando'a sensors, intent on capturing the Trade Federation leadership. Was this being their guard, Obi-Wan wondered, or an assassin sent for the Queen? Obi-Wan did not have long to contemplate such things. When the Zebrek moved, it was with the aggressive slashing style of Juyo. Obi-Wan had rarely faced users of this form, but he knew how to meet aggressiveness. Although he had placed himself in the ready position of Makashi, practically a taunt, he answered the first strike with the flowing defensives of Soresu. While he was not a Makashi duelist on par with his master, when he used Soresu, they were almost evenly matched. This fight, Obi-Wan knew, would be just as difficult, if in different ways. Every slash, every swipe, every aggressive attack was turned back by Obi-Wan's steady defense. They were both young and fit, but Obi-Wan had trained himself for stamina to outlast his opponent. Every strike was met with a solid block or flashing parry, stopped or turned aside. Despite that, Obi-Wan could feel his opponent strengthening. It took him a moment to realize why. The Darksider... No, this strength was more than that of a fallen Jedi like Xanatos or Kamari, or of a follower of one of the Dark Paths. This was a Sith, someone drawing upon corruption in the Force, and the Sith was fighting angry. Being thwarted only fueled that anger, which in turn strengthened the dark side, empowering them. While seated firmly in the light, Obi-Wan was unsure if the dark side could eventually overpower him. He didn't especially want to find out, either. He would have to make some offensive moves himself then, Obi-Wan decided. Carefully, he began slipping elusive Makashi strikes into his motions, harrying little jabs and twists that flicked against his opponent's blade. The Juyo the Sith used had no appreciable defenses. Everything focused on the attack. Eventually, Obi-Wan was able to turn one of those attacks back on the Darksider. With a sliding parry, Obi-Wan was able to shift into a lightning-fast jab! The Sith gasped, then choked on the blood in his lungs as Obi-Wan withdrew his blade from the Zabrak's chest. Fighting against almost anyone else, Obi-Wan would have gone for incapacitation rather than death. But a Sith, and one drawing so strongly on the dark side, no, that was a risk Obi-Wan did not dare take. Obi-Wan centered himself, releasing his regret and quieting his adrenaline response. The Force resounded dully with the death pains of the Zabrak. One heart struggled to do the work of two, stuttered, and stilled. Obi-Wan bowed his head, his pulse loud in his ears. His opponent had fought well, had earned Obi-Wan's respect. All the same, Obi-Wan could not regret the Sith's death. He had killed, yes, but in defense of his charge, his people, and his own life. The dark side still clung to the Zabrak's corpse when Obi-Wan approached it, and Obi-Wan couldn't help but be doubly thankful for his master's training. Not all Jedi prided themselves as highly on saber combat as Yondugu did, and Obi-Wan was certain that without his own desire to best his incredibly skilled master, he never would have been able to defeat the Darksider. Looking up, Obi-Wan glanced around. While he'd been aware of his surroundings as they influenced the fight, he hadn't exactly been mapping their progress. They had passed from the palace and through the hangars, and were deep within one of the plasma refineries. With a sigh, Obi-Wan glanced at his HUD. No one else was around. He reached out with the Force, easily finding Jango's familiar presence. His lover was, well, concentrating but not alarmed, and surrounded by others just as calm and concentrated. Satisfied that all was well with the royal party, Obi-Wan bundled the body up, then heaved it up onto his shoulder, attaching the long hilt of the saber staff at his belt. Reaching out with the Force, Obi-Wan ensured there were no other immediate dangers, then headed back towards the palace. As he moved through the corridors, Obi-Wan had to fight his way through a few patrols of battle droids. As he crossed the hangar, though, the droid patrols staggered, then stilled. Obi-Wan smiled grimly. Before long, he found the Queen, her handmaidens, and the bulk of the hot Mando'a in the throne room, an array of blasters pointed at two trembling Nemodians. He settled the Sith's body near the door, then approached.
Sir Jedi, the Viceroy was just surrendering, as his droid control ship has been destroyed and his army incapacitated, the Queen said coolly.
"Your Majesty,"
the Nemodian said, then blinked a few times, eyes straying to where Obi-Wan had laid down the dead Sith. The Viceroy sank into himself, bowing.
Captain Panaka,
the Queen directed, and Panaka stepped forward to take the Neimoidians into custody. Silence held until they had left the room.
We are glad to see you well, Sir Jedi, the Queen said. The other?
She asked, not quite certain how to refer to the other saber-wielder.
They are dead, Your Majesty, Obi-Wan said. I would ask the Mando'a for use of one of their stasis pods, ready for the transportation of the deceased. The body should be brought to the temple. They were a user of the dark side of the Force, and well trained enough to represent a clear danger to the Jedi.
Jango nodded. Such equipment was all but standard for the Mando'a who hunted bounties, as some of their quarry was far too dangerous to take in alive. The Queen nodded, then let out a slow breath, her shoulders dropping slightly as she began to relax a little.
Once we have freed our people from the camps, our contract will be fulfilled,
the Queen said, addressing Jango. Jango nodded. Pilots were dispatched to secure their ships and bring them to the palace hangars, and the Daybreaker settled into orbit with Mando starfighters patrolling to ensure the safety of Naboo. One of the Mando'a soon brought the stasis pod Obi-Wan had requested. Obi-Wan set the corpse within, taking advantage of the lull in activity to get a better look at his opponent. He estimated the Sith was around his own age, their slack face unlined. Feeling Jango's presence at his back, Obi-Wan looked back slightly.
Jari'eyc skanah,
Jango noted, and Obi-Wan couldn't help a snort of laughter. It was as much relief as amusement in truth. Obi-Wan shook his head and sealed the stasis pod, then turned fully and leaned into Jango, resting their foreheads together.
Marut ga,
Jango promised.
ganayc.
Obi-Wan smiled, drawing back slightly, then tapping their helmets together. Jango huffed softly.
All right, I know you can look after yourself,
Jango said with a slight grumble. It wasn't the first time either of them had been in danger since they began their relationship. Not even close. But usually if one of them was in danger, the other was either fighting at their side or didn't know about it until the danger was long past. The completion of the contract took another week, the Hot Mando'a assisting the Royal Naboo security forces as they dismantled the remaining droids and released the citizens from the camps. When their work was complete and the credits verified in the company account, the Queen invited the Mando'a to remain a little longer so that after a period of mourning, the liberation of Naboo could be celebrated. Obi-Wan was invited to remain as well and accepted without reservation. While the Naboo mourned and held funerals, Obi-Wan made himself useful with the relief efforts by day, spending time with Jango and the clan in the evenings. Although Theed was a large city with a bustling spaceport, it was built in close communion to the natural splendor of the surrounding area. Obi-Wan and Jango would walk along the rivers behind the palace at night, reminiscing about similar walks taken in Kaldabe when they were first getting to know one another, and bathing in the designated pools beneath the falls. After dark, there were few, if any, other swimmers, and they had the water to themselves.
Something's bothering you,
Jango observed one night as they lay together in the room the Queen had allotted them in the palace after their walk.
The Darksider,
Obi-Wan said, sitting up and scrubbing his hand through his hair.
That was far more than just someone who learned to use the Force. More than a fallen Jedi. I cannot help but think of them as Sith, despite that our histories say the Sith have been gone 1,000 years.
You think if there's one, there's more, Jango guessed.
I do,
Obi-Wan said grimly.
On the Trade Federation ship when I arrived, I had a bad feeling. I wonder now if it was the Darksider. I felt him again once we returned to Naboo, and while it eased immediately after I killed him...
He paused, shaking his head.
I'm uneasy still. Usually spending time with you brings me peace, joy. But I can't relax fully, even with extra meditation, and I don't think it's just the echoes of violence that remain here.
If there's more than one, Jango said and shrugged. If there's more than one, their friends might come looking for vengeance, Obi-Wan filled in. He nodded. The thought was worrying. He had defeated the Zabrak, but it had taken every bit of his skill.
Our patrols will keep an eye out, and the Naboo are all on high alert,
Jango reminded. I know, Obi-Wan said, then rolled his shoulders.
I just have a bad feeling.
Jango nodded, knowing that Obi-Wan's bad feelings were rarely without cause. 2 days later, a feeling of thick dread descended over Obi-Wan as he meditated before bed. The sheer presence of the incoming threat had Obi-Wan immediately on his feet, blades in hand and activated even as he opened his eyes. He panted, eyes wide, as he realized that the threat wasn't even planet-side yet. Jango alerted when Obi-Wan did and was watching him carefully. Obi-Wan took a shuddering breath, deactivating his sabers and then quickly pulling his armor back on. Jango rose from where he'd been reading and crossed to Obi-Wan, reaching out to touch his cheek.
Darjetii, much darker than the Zabrak, Obi-Wan said. I'd guess they're master, but I don't have the knowledge to back up that guess. So more dangerous than our dead friend?
Jango asked.
Much! Obi-Wan agreed. What the handle is this Jedi only business? You're more than welcome to help, but we very well might be marching to our deaths.
Ib'tuur, jate'shya, kyr'amur.
Jango replied with a slightly feral smile, and Obi-Wan kissed him long and hard before stepping back and jamming on his boucher.
I'll go rouse planetary defense. I'd like to meet this Darjetii head-on and away from as much collateral damage as possible, Obi-Wan said. I'll suit up and find you,
Jango murmured, nudging his forehead against the smooth shell of his lover's armor.
Oh yeah.
Obi-Wan nodded, and then he was turning on his heel and sprinting out the door. Blood bumping with anticipation, Jango hurriedly suited up in his best gargam and double-checked his armament, then strode after his jatne, calming his clan mates as he went. By the time he reached Obi-Wan's locator beacon, a dozen hot Mando'a had formed up behind them.
Mival, Tigal?
Jango asked as he approached. Obi-Wan turned, nodding in agreement.
Nas,
Obi-Wan said, then tilting his head slightly.
Planetary defense is letting a small ship through, likely a personal yacht. It nearly evaded the sensors. If they weren't still on high alert, it probably would have. They agreed not to hail it, just gently nudge it toward us by shifting the patrols. Palace has been notified and will stay back and let us handle it. Sounds good, Jango agreed. Let me make initial contact. I know I've been sparring with all of you, but Darksiders... There's something else. Obi-Wan nodded. Once we're engaged, if you think you can distract him in a way that will help me, go for it. But I know you have all seen me incapacitate and even killed just by deflecting blaster bolts, so don't underestimate them.
The others all nodded. They had all faced Obi-Wan on the training grounds, and many had also seen him in battle. They knew that the best way to help their Jedi was mostly to stay out of his way.
All right. Good hunting,
Obi-Wan said, and they scattered, tracking the incoming ship as it descended. The ship that finally touched down on the outskirts of Theed was small and agile, as reports had indicated. Despite suspecting this enemy already knew they were there, Obi-Wan and the Mando'a remained hidden, watching with their sensor nets spread wide. The ship settled to the ground with an eerie level of quietness. The baffles and dampers required to muffle the sound of such massive engines must have been state-of-the-art, and neither Obi-Wan nor any of the Mando'a had ever seen anything like it. Someone let out a quiet whistle of appreciation over their in-helmet comps, which someone else followed with a nervous chuckle. Obi-Wan worried for a moment that they'd get distracted in teasing and bickering, but the quiet pneumatic hiss of the airlocks disengaging stilled them to absolute silence. The being that stealthily emerged from the shadowed interior of the ship was tall, far taller than any human Obi-Wan had ever known. Their head, what little of it he could see, was elongated as well. Humanoid, but not a human, and the screaming maelstrom in the Force. Obi-Wan was certain the Zabrak had been a Sith. This being... He was even more certain they were Sith, the darkness and almost overwhelming blot of wrongness in Obi-Wan's Force sense. Swallowing, Obi-Wan activated his various recording devices, then signaled silently to Jango. He would engage first, and the Mando'a would do what they could. Stepping out into the clearing, Obi-Wan engaged his regular saber, again keeping the dark saber in reserve. A low, rusty laugh sounded, and a long, thin hand appeared from beneath dark robing. The hilt of a lightsaber glinted in the moonlight. Silence trembled, and then the blade hissed to life. Sith red. Obi-Wan swore to himself, settling into position to wait. The Sith circled interminably, and Obi-Wan shifted, his focus narrowed to his opponent. He was sure the Sith had registered the presence of the Mando'a, but he had to trust in their skill to protect them, and his own ability to hold the enemy's attention. The stalemate dragged on, the Force itself seeming to hold its breath. A searing red bolt finally split the night courtesy of one of the Mando'a. The Sith batted the blaster bolt away as if it were nothing, raising their long hand imperiously. The Force roiled, and Obi-Wan heard the heavy thunk of an armored super commando hitting a tree trunk at high speed. "Bad idea!" Obi-Wan heard someone, likely the unlucky commando, whisper over their comms, voice trembling, followed by a wave of nervous sniggering. He didn't let their voices distract him, though. He didn't know the Sith's true purpose here on Naboo, but reason and history both told him it would not be good. He was a Jedi, and it was his obligation to destroy any Sith he met. If he died in the effort, so be it. The Sith evidently tired of their standoff and flicked their hand outward. Obi-Wan gasped as an invisible hand closed around his throat, lifting him off his feet. He was too far away to strike the Sith with his main weapon, a weapon with which the Sith clearly didn't much concern himself. Panicking, Obi-Wan struggled ineffectively in that grasp, feet kicking against the air as his vision began to tunnel, his offhand scrabbling at his neck, trying to dislodge a hand that wasn't actually there. He heard a distant roar and wasn't sure if it was actual sound or just his blood thundering in his ears. Obi-Wan clattered to the ground, gasping for air. He struggled to keep his eyes open, to keep his weapon in hand, to rise. Light blossomed in his fuzzy vision, and it took him a moment to realize that Jango had gone airborne and was firing at an almost impossible rate from above, while the rest of the hot Mando'a peppered the Sith from cover. Obi-Wan dragged himself to his feet and engaged both his sabers, chest heaving as he threw himself at the Sith, trusting his Beskar Gam and his clan to let him get close enough to engage the Sith again. Faced with this multitude of determined opponents, the Sith gave ground. There were simply too many angles to defend against, and the hot Mando'a were used to attacking as a unit. Obi-Wan didn't know or care if the Sith had experience fighting with or against groups. He just wanted to defeat this abomination. The Sith fought only as much as they needed to retreat, though, backing towards their vessel until they could throw themselves into their ship's ramp, then sending Obi-Wan crashing backwards with a wave of the Force. The engines flared, and a searing wash of heat sent Obi-Wan and the hot Mando'a to the ground despite the protection of their armor. The ship roared into the night, leaving a weary and confused band of fighters behind. "I'll scare!" someone swore dismally, and Obi-Wan couldn't help his slightly hysterical laugh, rolling to lay on his back and stare skyward, thankful for the moment just to be alive. The ship was gone, and the Sith with it. They must have jumped to hyperspace almost before clearing Naboo's gravity well. Obi-Wan doubted the Sith was injured enough to die from their wounds. The urgency of his need to contact the Council had just increased at least tenfold. The round domed top of a boucher cut off Obi-Wan's view of the stars, and he huffed, then sat up, pulling off his helmet to look up at Jango. Jango tilted his head slightly in question. Obi-Wan just shook his head. "Nothing, just thanking the Force you decided to come and bring the clan with you," Obi-Wan admitted. "I doubt I could have defeated them alone, and yet, while they were much stronger than the first, there were so few similarities between them." "You think there's a third Darjetii out there?" Jango said, seeing where Obi-Wan was going. Obi-Wan nodded grimly. "The Council is going to be furious," Obi-Wan said with a wry smile. "One Sith could be waved off as someone who stumbled into a temple they shouldn't, or happened across an artifact our shadows missed. 2? Possibly a third? That means there are likely more that are organized. That means the last 1,000 years they've been waiting, planning, and we didn't even know we were being watched." Jango nodded. "Sith. He knew the stories well enough. The Sith were the monsters even Mando'a used to scare their children into compliance. The Jedi Council likely wouldn't be the only ones alarmed." As Jango anticipated, Mando and Naboo alike were all on high alert the next few days before the celebration to mark the liberation of the planet. The sight of patrolling Mando'a seemed to reassure the Naboo, as did Obi-Wan's continued presence. The night before the celebration, Obi-Wan and Jango went one last time up to the pools for a moonlight swim. There were a few others out and about, the city growing crowded as people arrived from the surrounding areas for the upcoming festivities. Despite there being more bathers, they found a fairly secluded pool to enjoy. "It's beautiful here," Obi-Wan couldn't help but comment, laying on a smooth boulder near the falls, staring up at 2 of the luminous moons of Naboo. "It is," Jango agreed, his eyes on Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan glanced over and blushed. "I don't want it to end," Obi-Wan said softly. "I know it will end, all things do, but
If its stars burn out,
Django agreed philosophically, wading out of the pool and laying down next to Obi-Wan. He wrapped his arms around Obi-Wan and pulled him close.
I don't want it to end either, Jari'eyc. I can no longer imagine my life without you in it, even if I can't always keep you at my side.
We've weathered all separations well.
Obi-Wan said, and Django nodded.
We have. The credits we spend on comm service probably helps.
And the fact that we're able to meet up fairly often, even if it's just for a few hours at a time.
We knew it would be hard getting involved with our duties being what they are.
We did,
Obi-Wan agreed, tucking his head against Django's shoulder.
And all that, the credits, the time apart, it's still worth it to be with you in these moments of peace.
For me too,
Django said.
It won't get any easier from here. But like I said, I can't imagine my life without you in it.
Me either.
Obi-Wan settled slightly at that, something in him easing. It certainly wasn't the easiest relationship, but it was worth it. When he was with Django like this, at peace, the Force sang in harmony. It wasn't assurance that everything would work out, but Obi-Wan felt no indication that it was the wrong path either. All the more reason to relish making love in the plush suite they'd been afforded as Her Majesty's guests. As they laid in bed together later that night, Obi-Wan couldn't help but remember the marriage vows Arla had taught him.
Mi solus tome.
We are one together.
Mi solus dartome.
We are one when apart.
Mi medinui an.
We share all.
Mi bajere verde.
We shall raise warriors. They had discussed the last vow early on, in light of their obligations to their people. Obi-Wan would surely take a better one in time, maybe more than one, depending on the path of his career as a Jedi. The other tenants, they were together in spirits, even when half the galaxy was between them. And when they weren't together in the same place, the Force sang. Obi-Wan knew that the hot Mando'a wouldn't argue against the two of them swearing vows to one another. Most of them would be pleased to know that the two of them had taken that step. Arla had been teasing about it almost since the beginning, and Miles and Silas were just as bad. Django hadn't brought it up explicitly, but their conversations had circled around the idea quite a few times. Obi-Wan knew that, as usual, Django was letting him set the pace. The Jedi were a little more complicated. Master Ki-Adi-Mundi was married and sat on the High Council. Some knights and masters, while not officially married, lived together and only took paired missions, sharing their lives more closely than some married beings did. But as a culture, for the most part, marriage just wasn't something the Jedi did, at least not in recent history. It was not marriage itself, Obi-Wan reasoned, that would be seen as questionable by the Jedi, but what it represented. The perception that he valued Django and Django's well-being above that of any other sentient. Obi-Wan knew that if he formalized his relationship with Django, he could do nothing about that perception, except be as unbiased as possible. Some Jedi would question his decisions, and it was likely he'd never be assigned missions in Mando space again. Yoda would scold, and so would many of the other counselors. They would watch him closely, but they already did that. Setting aside what the Order would think, Obi-Wan meditated on the relationship itself. It was over a year since they'd met on Galadran. They had proved that they could maintain the relationship despite going for months without seeing one another. Their time actually together was always over too quickly, but Obi-Wan had never neglected his duty as a Jedi to try and steal more time with Django. And he knew Django had maintained his commitments as Mandalore with equal diligence. In some ways, saying the traditional vows wouldn't change anything. They would still have to part when their duty called. They would likely continue to spend more time apart than together. But Obi-Wan also knew that Django would be pleased to have their relationship given the weight of the oaths. He breathed, sinking into the Force. As always, it buoyed him up, Django's presence warm at his side. Obi-Wan rolled onto his side, looking at Django. He smiled, just letting himself feel for a few moments. Reaching out, he brushed a stray curl from Django's forehead, smiling when Django frowned slightly, eyebrows drawing down.
I'm ready,
Obi-Wan declared, his fingers tracing a faded scar on Django's cheek. than the curl of his sirtin, where it traced his father's lineage. Django asked sleepily.
Gotal'ur, riduurok.
Obi-Wan said quietly, remembering the traditional words and vows Arla had taught him, and Django's eyes snapped open.
What?
Django asked, the thread of eager delight in his voice, and Obi-Wan smiled at his lover's sleepy confusion.
Ni kirtal gardarasum.
Obi-Wan murmured, speaking the Mando'a words of love for the first time as he leaned in to brush their mouths together.
Jorhaa'ir to riduurok tini.
He declared more firmly. He wanted to formalize their relationship.
Elek,
Django breathed, shifting up onto his knees and offering his hands. Obi-Wan knelt up as well, placing his hands in Django's. They swallowed in unison as their eyes met, and Obi-Wan couldn't help but smile.
Mi solus tome, mi solus dartome, mi mendinui an, mi bajuri verde. Mi solus tome, mi solus dartome, mi mendinui an, mi bajuri verde.
Django and Obi-Wan recited together, their voices husky with emotion as they spoke the marriage vows.
Ni kirtal gardarasum.
Django breathed, leaning forward to rest their foreheads together.
Ni kirtal.
Obi-Wan murmured with a smile and kissed his husband. They fell together into the bed, kisses growing more intense. Django took Obi-Wan slowly face to face and staring into one another's eyes until they were gasping with pleasure. They traded words of love and came clinging together. Obi-Wan fell asleep in Django's arms and woke to Django's kisses. He smiled as he opened his eyes, then smiled wider at the open joy on Django's face.
Ni kirtal gardarasum.
Obi-Wan greeted warmly. Django grinned.
Ni kirtal.
Django said, and Obi-Wan felt like his spaceman split in half. He was smiling so broadly. They kissed again and likely wouldn't have moved from the bed all day if they hadn't heard the palace coming to life around them. Today the Naboo would celebrate their liberation. There would be a parade and speeches and a feast when night fell. Once those formalities were over, Obi-Wan knew that he and Django would likely have a celebration of their own with a hot Mando'a.